I've never been entirely happy with that slogan of my many Quaker friends with whom I've shared plenty of experiences about speaking truth to power. We should be speaking truth about power, but not to power, rather to the people who are going to get rid of it. And that's a slightly different slant on the thing, I think. Maybe it doesn't ring as well, but it seems to me more accurate. Well, as you all know, our meeting happens to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, the other end of the country, and it is almost inevitable, I guess, but even appropriate that we should take this time to think seriously about contours of world order as they were then, what the prospects are for them now, and what the factors are that have determined them and will continue to determine them. Well, 50 years ago, there were two conflicting visions of the new world order of the day. You're only hearing one of them in the commentary on the United Nations, and it's in fact only one of them that gets publicly articulated, but there was another one. They're both highly relevant today, I think. The one that one hears all the time is the vision of the United Nations and all the wondrous things we hope for and are dedicated to. The United Nations may now be facing its demise because of its alleged failure in bringing about these marvelous things to which we're committed. The second vision is what's sometimes called realism in international relations theory, which is critical of what they call the utopianism that accompanied the forming of the United Nations and that still resounds in the rhetoric. And the realist vision was also articulated 50 years ago, in fact, with great clarity, perhaps most clearly by one of the most respected statesmen of the 20th century, in fact, speaking for the victors in World War III, Winston Churchill, one of the World War II, sorry, that's the next one, speaking for one of the big three, one of the victors. He explained at the time, 50 years ago, that, in his words, the government of the world must be entrusted to the satisfied nations who wish nothing more for themselves than what they had. Our power placed us above the rest. We are like rich men dwelling in peace within our habitations, rather ample habitations, and we must keep the hungry nations under control or there'll be danger. Well, that's the realist vision. Earlier in the century, in fact, at the peak of British power, right before World War I, Churchill articulated this vision with greater clarity in internal discussions of the British cabinet, which have only recently been declassified, released. Here he said, "We are not a young people with an innocent record and a scanty inheritance. We have engrossed to ourselves an altogether disproportionate share of the wealth and traffic of the world. We have got all we want in territory, but our claim to be left in the unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force, often seems less reasonable to others than to us. So we have to teach them regular lessons in reasonableness." And in fact, in this internal secret meeting, he was calling for an increase in the military budget so that the lessons can be taught better. A sanitized version of that did reach the public with all the offending phrases removed, but that's the actual version, and a very good one. I ought to add that the more humane among the conquerors didn't always find the measure so reasonable. For example, Adam Smith, who bitterly, 200 years ago, bitterly condemned what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, who, as he saw very clearly, were brutally creating the first world, third world divide that's now so dramatic and was much less so at the time, in fact, virtually undetectable at the time, created, as he pointed out, by the savage injustice of the Europeans. Well, Adam Smith was a figure of the Enlightenment, pre-capitalist and in fact anti-capitalist in fundamental ways, and he was also smart enough to detect the fundamental illusions of the realist position. One of them was that, contrary to Winston Churchill, the rich men are never satisfied. Rather, as Adam Smith pointed out, they will always follow what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. Second, the we who are enjoying their vast and splendid possessions acquired by violence were not the people of England or France or the United States and so on, except for accidental exceptions. Rather, as Smith put it, the principal architects of state policy design it to ensure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of their own country. Which is quite a valid observation. The principal architects, he went on to say, were the merchants and manufacturers. That's changed. Now it's the huge transnationals and financial institutions. But the picture is valid. He was no fool. So to correct the realist illusion story, the realist vision with Adam Smith's insights, it comes out like this. The rich men of the rich societies will pursue their vile maxim, seeking to expand their vast and splendid possessions, which they have gained by violence and maintained by force, resorting to savage injustice when necessary, and those who don't play that game will fall by the wayside. The lot of the vast majority of the population is just to serve and to suffer. That's the realist vision. Incidentally, these observations of Adam Smith's and Churchill's can be generalized to domestic forms of property, so-called property rights, and possibly even to a proposition that's being debated not too far from here, but I leave that to you. Well, that's one vision of world order. The other was the vision of the United Nations, or at least the rhetoric that accompanied its founding. And I won't review that because we're engulfed in it all the time in a flood of such pronouncements presented with great self-adulation as our permanent and noble commitment. Since you know all this by heart, I won't waste time on it. We can ask realistically, however, whether the people who produced the rhetoric have ever believed a word of what they were saying, or whether either consciously or maybe not too far below the surface, they actually adopted the realist vision that was advocated by Winston Churchill and corrected and condemned by Adam Smith. That's a fair question, and I think historical practice provides a rather clear, if not particularly flattering answer to it. Well, there are, of course, plenty of people who are deeply committed to the vision of the rhetoric and who hoped and often sought to make it a lot more than that. I suspect that that includes the vast majority of the population of the world, which is why reality always has to be masked in so much secrecy and deceit. It's, after all, easier to tell the truth. Why construct the illusions? Also, this includes some fairly prominent individuals. But power has always resided elsewhere. Those were the visions of world order then. We know which one succeeded, and I don't think it's fundamentally different now. Going back to the United Nations, in the United States, attitudes toward the UN, the ones articulated that we can read, the ones that are articulated by the educated classes, folks like us, they have oscillated all over the place throughout these last 50 years, from great praise to utter contempt. I'll return to that at the end, suggesting a kind of a realist principle that gives, I think, a simple explanation for the variations. But first, let's take a look at the major arguments that are now current as to why the United Nations has failed in its mission and why we have to maybe get rid of it, and what all this tells us about the realities of world order. There are two basic failures of the United Nations that appear in all the discussions. One is that during the Cold War, it was paralyzed, and then there was this moment of hope after the Cold War ended, but the illusions were shattered by the rise of ethnic conflicts and the failure of the United Nations to deal with them. That's the basic story. So to give a couple of representative quotes from the moment of hopefulness around 1990, I'm quoting from leading columnists and editorial writers in the Washington Post and the New York Times, but this is perfectly typical. There was a flood of this stuff. I've got a lot of it in print if you're interested. It's virtually exceptionless. So here's typical examples. During the long Cold War years, the Soviet veto and the hostility of third world nations made the United Nations an object of contempt, of scorn to many Americans who were rightly appalled by the sight of grim-faced Soviet ambassadors casting vetoes and storming out of Security Council meetings and shrill anti-Western rhetoric from the third world. But with the end of the Cold War, this is from 1990, with the end of the Cold War in 1989 and 1989, Soviet policy changed, and that brought about a wondrous sea change in the United Nations, which can finally work the way it was designed to. That's completely typical of a flood of rhetoric from that period. Then came the disillusionment. The era of ethnic conflicts replaced the Cold War. The United Nations again failed to deal with them, so maybe the time has come to bid it farewell. That more or less encapsulates the story. Well, let's have a closer look at these two eras of modern history and what they actually tell us, which I think is a little different. With regard to the Cold War, there's again a standard version. I won't waste much time on it because it's too familiar. It was articulated, for example, by President Kennedy. The communist world, he said, from Havana to Moscow to Peking, as it was in those days, to Saigon and so on. The communist world, he said, is a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy planning to take over all the rest. His right-hand man, Robert McNamara, elaborated. He said that Soviet aggression has no historical parallel. Its goal is total obliteration without any hint of moral restraint anywhere in the entire literature of Marxism and communism. So therefore our stance is defensive. We are defending civilized values from the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy which aims at total obliteration. There's a lot of stuff like that. I won't go on. There's also a kind of a more sober version of this, which you find in the better scholarship. So, for example, and let me turn to that, take, say, John Lewis Gaddis, who's maybe the most respected of contemporary diplomatic historians and a major Cold War historian as well, who pretty much accepts what's called the orthodox version of the Cold War, nowadays sometimes called post-revisionist, for those of you who know this stuff. Rather realistically, he traces the Cold War to 1917, agreeing with George Kennan and many others, and I think that's right. And he explains that, of course, there was an immediate invasion of Russia right after the Bolshevik coup or revolution or takeover, whatever you call it. There was an immediate invasion, and he explains that as defensive. The West carried out a defensive invasion. Incidentally, on the side, that invasion was taken pretty seriously. So Britain, for example, used poison gas, which at that time was the ultimate atrocity. This is right after World War I. Poison gas was usually reserved to what were called recalcitrant Arabs and uncivilized tribesmen, among whom it would spread a lively terror. I'm again quoting Winston Churchill from secret documents, also worth reading. But in this case, it was possible to use the ultimate weapon even against white people, not just Kurds and Afghans who Churchill was talking about. So it was taken very seriously, the defensive invasion. But let's go back to why it was a defensive invasion. Well, Gaddis explains, the reason is it was a preemptive strike. It was taken in order to prevent potential Soviet actions, so therefore it was defensive. As he puts it, it was undertaken in response to a potentially far-reaching intervention by the new Soviet government in the internal affairs, not just of the West, but of virtually every country in the world, namely the revolution's challenge to the very survival of the capitalist system. So that's serious business. Now, what was that challenge? Well, obviously, it wasn't a challenge by military conquest. Nobody claims that that was true in the time. Some claim that it was true, years later. Incidentally, Gaddis, like other serious historians, and the internal record also discounted for the later period. But for this period, it's not even under debate. So that wasn't the challenge. Rather, the challenge was a demonstration effect of an alternative an alternative development model, which it was feared might have great appeal to not only in the traditional service areas, what's now called the Third World, but even at home. among working people and the poor in the industrial societies themselves. That, incidentally, was a prospect that very greatly concerned Lloyd George in England, Woodrow Wilson here, and others. Incidentally, that remains, if you look at the documentary record, the dominant theme until the record runs dry, which is now in the 1960s. So you go all the way through up to the, say, interchanges between Kennedy and Prime Minister Macmillan in the early 60s. It was always fear of the demonstration effect of successful development. It was the perceived success of the so-called communist model, had nothing to do with communism, but it was the so-called success of that model that was considered the threat, which is entirely understandable when you compare what was going on there to what was going on in comparable Western domains. And maybe educated Americans can't see that, but people around the world can see it very well, because they now benefit from our education, which prevents us from seeing what's obvious and was indeed obvious to planners. Now, of course, Stalin in particular carried out horrifying crimes, maybe some of the worst of history, but these awesome crimes are totally irrelevant to the story. And that's, again, pretty clear from the documentary record. So take, say, Truman. Truman liked Stalin. He admired him. He said he was honest. He said what goes on in Russia is none of his business. He said it would be a disaster if anything happened. This is all in private. It would be a disaster if anything happened to Stalin. This is around 1945. So, he said, in fact, he could get along fine with Stalin as long as the United States got its way 85% of the time. That was the issue. Churchill was the same. As late as after Yalta, that means February 1945, Churchill in internal cabinet meetings in Britain was defending Stalin as, honest man, we can trust, great man, so on and so forth. The crimes were completely irrelevant. They knew about them, of course, but that's not significant. And that fits into a very traditional pattern. Saddam Hussein, Trujillo, Suharto, you go through the list. The crimes are irrelevant. That goes up to the limit. So it includes that admirable Italian gentleman, as President Roosevelt called the man who brought fascism to Italy, who was greatly admired. It includes even Hitler in internal records up until the late 30s when he started to get out of line. It's disobedience that's the crime, not the crimes. Now, if anything is clear in history, that is. The record on that is completely overwhelming, and it's also true of Stalin. The couple of years before the Kennedy-Macmillan discussions, early 60s, on the demonstration effect, President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles, again an internal secret discussion since declassified, they highlighted the central issue. They were lamenting what they called, this is all quotes, the ability of the communists to appeal directly to the masses and to gain control of mass movements, something we have no capacity to duplicate. And the reason is that the poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. Now, as Eisenhower and Dulles understood, their position on who should plunder whom was going to be a pretty hard sell. So it was kind of like an unfair competition in the, in the general arena. And so that's an old worry. It goes back to the founding of American constitutional system. If you read the debates over in 1787 over the constitutional convention, most strikingly and most interesting is James Madison, who was the main framer. I mean, it was his ideas that got incorporated. And he warns very strongly against the danger of allowing a democratic system to develop. He discusses what would happen if they allowed it to develop in England, which was then the model of democracy. He said, the majority of the population will undermine the rights of landed proprietors, and obviously we can't allow that. Our system has to be designed, he said, and was designed, so that in his words, so that the government will fulfill its primary responsibility, and the prime responsibility of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, because you got these people out here who are always trying to plunder the minority of the opulent, and that has to be prevented, and the constitutional system was designed to prevent it, and that theme runs right through all of our history, in the actual history. Now, I'm only sampling from a very rich record, which suggests a rather different perspective on the Cold War. That different perspective, in fact, I think is reinforced pretty powerfully when you look further, and it tells us a lot about the future as well. One place where you can look further is in the very rich record of declassified planning documents, which stress quite forcefully that the major threat to U.S. interests is what is called sometimes radical nationalism or economic nationalism that calls for improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs on the principle that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources should be the people of that country, not foreign investors. That's a conception that must be destroyed in all its forms. That's a constant theme, these are all quotes, constant theme right through the internal planning record at the highest level, exactly as it was for the British before us, and I presume for other countries too, but I haven't examined the records of France and other countries. The same conclusion is strongly supported by a look at the public record. And that's obviously too great to sample, but it's substantial and quite intriguing. So just take one pretty dramatic case of it. Not a few years ago, you recall in 1986, the World Court condemned the United States for what they called its unlawful use of force, in other words, international terrorism or aggression against Nicaragua, and for its illegal economic warfare against Nicaragua. That was 1986 in the World Court. U.S., of course, refused to accept the judgment. Congress immediately responded, Democrat-controlled Congress, responded to the World Court judgment by increasing by a huge amount, $100 million, the U.S. aid to the international terrorists who were carrying out the unlawful use of force as American agents. And what was used to ram through the real thing that was most efficiently rammed through and enabled the Reagan administration to ram this through was the appeal to what was called the Sandinistas' revolution without borders. They had actually announced a revolution without borders. They were going to conquer the world, these guys in Nicaragua, and they'd announced it. And since they'd announced it, we had to defend ourselves with another one of these preemptive strikes. So therefore, too bad about the World Court or anything else. We'll go on with international terrorism at a massive scale. Now, the revolution without, and that was all over the press, the journals, went on, big propaganda theme right for a long time. And it was a kind of an interesting, it wasn't totally false. It was interesting and true in an interesting way when you look at it. There was a basis for it. The basis for it was indeed a speech by Thomas Borge, Sandinista, in which he said that every country has to carry out its own revolution, and we can't do anything about other people, but we would like to create a society that will be a model that others will want to follow. And that's, in that sense, he said, our revolution transcends borders. That was the actual text. It was known. Like the fact, as soon as the propaganda system started using this as a threat of conquest, it was exposed, and prominently, like right in the Washington Post. But it didn't matter. It was true anyway. And in a sense, it expressed a deeper truth. The deeper truth is that the threat was the same, the demonstration of threat, and that's the same as military conquest. So therefore, we have to defend ourselves by violence against the threat that an alternative might be proposed that people might choose to follow. Well, there's plenty of that in the public record. Take a look at the post-Cold War period. That also gives you some good insight into what the Cold War was about. In fact, that's a good idea generally. A good rule of thumb is to take a look at what happens after a war is over and see who's cheering and who's complaining. When you do that, you often get a surprising insight into what the war was actually about. Try it out on the Second World War and you get some interesting conclusions. But let's take the Cold War. So after the Cold War, so say post-1989, who's rejoicing and who's unhappy? That tells you something. Always does. So who's rejoicing? Well, let's look at the East, Eastern Europe. Who's rejoicing in Eastern Europe? Well, that's very clear. The old Communist Party leadership. They're better off than they're rich beyond their wildest dreams, very powerful. The only difference is that now they're the agents of Western power. In other words, they're now playing the typical role of third world elites, very rich, very powerful, favored by the West, who loves them. In fact, there's even a name for them. They're called the capitalist nomenklatura. The nomenklatura is the old Stalinist commissars, now, working for the bosses in the West, and very rich and very powerful, favored, opening up a franchise in Moscow. Those are the guys you want to run it, tough, know the ropes, and so on and so forth. So they're delighted. They're the winners of the Cold War. The old Stalinist bureaucracy and command, they won the Cold War, and they're rejoicing. What about there's others who are rejoicing too. For example, CEOs of Western corporations. Western corporate world is rejoicing as well. And they're rejoicing for quite good reasons, which are explained openly and frankly in the international business press, like the Financial Times, which is the most important international business journal in London, which had an article about 2 years ago with the interesting headline, "Green Shoots in Communism's Ruins," meaning the whole thing is a wreck, but there's some green shoots, there's some good things. What are the green shoots? Well, the green shoots, they said, are that with the reforms that have been instituted in Eastern Europe, the reforms, they say, have led to great impoverishment and very high unemployment, which means that now Western investors can get well-trained, well-educated, healthy workers at a fraction of the cost of the pampered Western workers who are going to have to abandon their luxurious lifestyles, as Business Week added. So this is really great. We've got a new weapon against our own population. Now we can not only invest in, Indonesia and Mexico, but we can get these guys in Poland too for 10% the wages of the pampered Western workers. And of course, since none of these people believe in the free market except for everyone else, when Daimler-Benz or Audi or GM or somebody invests there, they insist on very high tariff protection and all sorts of infrastructure support and so on. Exactly, incidentally, as when Daimler-Benz invests in Alabama, which they treat as a third world country properly, and where they get the same amenities. But now they got all of Eastern Europe opening up to them. So they're among the winners of the Cold War, too. So there's two categories of winners of the Cold War. Well, let's go on. What about the people of Eastern Europe? They're not so happy about it. In fact, the Financial Times, again, just it's been running regular polls. The polls now in Eastern Europe are well run, Gallup polls and all that stuff. And they're interesting. The latest poll, they've been asking people to tell what the best period in Russian history is. This is Russia. Around 1992, 50% said the best period was pre-perestroika, before the whole thing fell apart. Last April, the last one, that went up to 67%, said that was the best period. Meanwhile, optimism about the future is declining. It's Russia, rather general. People are, of course, delighted, and properly, by the collapse of the tyranny, but they're not so delighted about about the result of the so-called reforms. Reform is supposed to be a good thing. That's why the word is used. And the reforms have had a devastating effect in most of the region. So, for example, in Russia alone, they've led to about an extra 500,000 deaths a year, according to a UNESCO report, which incidentally supports them and says it's necessary. But in any event, the reforms have been very harmful to the general population, who are complaining bitterly about it. So they're not among the victors. They're among the losers of the Cold War. What about in the West? Well, those pampered Western workers who are have another weapon against them to force them to give up their luxurious lifestyles. They're not so overjoyed about it either. And indeed, at some level at least, they are well aware of this new weapon in the hands of the masters to drive down wages and benefits and increase working hours and maintain the huge increase in corporate profits that's gone on since the end of the Cold War, and indeed to contribute to this spectacular redistribution of wealth that's taken place in the United States in the last 15 years, now escalating. So they're not among the victors. Well, again, now take a look and ask who the winners were and who the losers were, and you get a certain picture of what it was about, a useful technique after any conflict. Well, this alternative, and I think more realistic perspective, makes a good deal of sense in broader historical terms as well, and carries us forward. So the East-West conflict, in fact, had many of the features of the so-called North-South conflict. That's the euphemism for Europe's conquest of the world in the last 500 years. The North-South conflict, the basic property of it is the one I just indicated. the service areas, it's now called the Third World or the South, they can carry out what's called complementary development, but not competitive development. They have to be subordinated to the needs of the rich men who run the rich societies. And if they try to move towards independent economic nationalism, it has to be crushed, because they're servants, like Churchill and other realists said. And as I say, it runs through the whole record. Furthermore, if they seem to be succeeding in independent development, then it's even worse. Then they become what are called rotten apples who might spoil the barrel, or a virus that might infect others, and they really have to be stopped because of the demonstration effect. So, for example, Henry Kissinger, when the time of the Allende regime in Chile, warned that the success of social democratic Chile would be a virus that might infect people all the way to Italy. And he didn't think that Chile was going to conquer Italy, but it was sending the wrong message to Italian voters, namely, here's an alternative you might want to pursue, and we can't allow that, so it's got to be crushed. That's basically the North-South conflict, and a good deal of the East-West conflict fits right into that framework. It becomes even more clear when you think about the history. Eastern and Western Europe have been separating for about over 500 years. Around the 15th century, they started to split, actually in a fault line right down Germany, with the West beginning to develop and the East becoming its service area. And that division deepened right up to the 20th century. So Russia was a deeply impoverished third world country, getting poorer relative to the West, right up to 1917. And that same was true of most of Eastern Europe after that. It was a standard, it was the traditional third world, providing resources and markets and investment opportunities. And there was a very wealthy class, of course, but that's true of every third world country. Of course, even at this period, when Russia was a deeply impoverished third world country, it was different from others. So under the Tsar, it had a big military force. It was very different in scale. It wasn't Grenada, you know. It had a big military force, and that was a worry. So it was an unusual third world country. And that persists right through the Cold War, too, meaning that this aspect of the North-South conflict took on a life of its own because of questions of scale. But aside from that, it has many of the familiar features, if you look over it in the historical range, and everything fits pretty much into place, I think, when you look at it that way, as does the aftermath. That is what has happened since 1990, as the region mostly returns to its earlier origins. There were sectors that were parts of the industrial West, like the Czech Republic or Western Poland, and they're returning to that. Most of it was third world, and it's returning to that very dramatically, which explains, I think, certainly explains who's happy and who's unhappy, but I think also adds to the account of what in fact was going on. Well, this picture is reinforced when you look at the continuity of policy since, which is nothing changed. End of the Cold War, nothing changed. Take, say, the Pentagon budget. We had to have a huge Pentagon budget to defend ourselves from the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. Okay, monolithic and ruthless conspiracy is gone. Pentagon budget is the same. Barely declined, now going up. It's actually higher already than it was in real terms than under Nixon, and it's going up. So obviously something wrong there. Or take, say, Cuba, which we had to defend ourselves against by international terrorism and legal embargo and so on ever since 1960, because it was a tentacle of the, this monolithic and ruthless conspiracy bent on total obliteration, which was going to strangle us. So we had to defend ourselves against it by the biggest terrorist campaign in history, in fact, unless you count Nicaragua, plus the economic warfare. Okay, 1989, Berlin Wall falls. It's whatever you think about it, it's no longer a tentacle of the, it's no longer part of the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. So what's the effect? The effect is we increase the attack on Cuba. The economic warfare is tightened. But now it's for another reason. Turns out it wasn't because of the fear of Cuba all this time. It turns out it was because of our profound concern for human rights and democracy. And the propaganda, if you look back, you'll notice that the doctrinal system didn't miss a beat. Nobody noticed, or pretended at least not to notice, this rather sudden change that took place. And in fact, the concern about human rights and democracy is about as plausible as the fear that Cuba was going to invade us and destroy us. Whatever you think of Castro, take any view you like, the harshest condemnation you like, he looks positively saintly in comparison to the guys that we support throughout the region. That, again, is not controversial. The real problem about Cuba, which explains the continuity all the way through, was illustrated pretty well in what happened in the UN yesterday. You can read it in the front page of this morning's paper. Castro issued what the New York Times calls his controversial call for social justice, which is just as controversial, they say, as his critique of American imperialism. And worse, he got more applause from the delegates than Clinton did. So that's a problem. The problem is, but you're not supposed to notice it. If you've got benefits of a proper education like us, you sort of read those words, but you don't see what that means. The problem, in fact, is that the standards of health and social services and education, and in fact even high tech that have been achieved there, which other people in the world who aren't as well educated as we are can see. That's the problem. There's plenty to criticize about Cuba for people who are seriously concerned with human rights and democracy, now excluding everybody who's talking about it. But people who are serious about it, yeah, plenty to criticize. But as far as the doctrinal institutions are concerned, and certainly the planning system, it's the successes that are the problem, the threat. It's what Oxfam once called the threat of a good example when they were name of a pamphlet in which they were discussing the U.S. attack against Nicaragua, and that's accurate. Well, anyway, policy has persisted, in fact, even got harsher under ludicrous pretexts with the end of the Cold War, which tells you whatever it was about, it wasn't what they were saying, just as in the Pentagon budget. Or take what immediately followed the Cold War. What immediately followed the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, absolute end of the Cold War. A couple of weeks later, the U.S. invaded Panama. Absolutely typical, footnote to history. In fact, about the only difference from a million other examples like that is that the pretexts were different. In fact, the pretexts were like the ones that Woodrow Wilson used right before the Cold War when he invaded Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and there was no monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. Then he was defending us from the Huns, if you remember. This time, George Bush, when he invaded, was defending us against Hispanic narco-traffickers. But other than that, it was the same as before. Same actions, footnote to history, no changes. Let's turn finally to the United Nations. What happened? The United Nations happened to be in session at the time, has a winter session. So winter 1989, fall-winter 1989, the UN was in session. And there were indeed Security Council vetoes, in fact 3. One of them, voted 14-1, was on Israel's practices in the occupied territories, vetoed by the United States. 2 further Security Council resolutions were condemned the U.S. attack on Panama, vetoed by the United States. Those are the only Security Council resolutions vetoed. The General Assembly had a few, in fact, highly lopsided votes. In fact, 2 votes against everyone else. U.S. and Israel alone voting against a resolution which condemned U.S. international terrorism against Nicaragua. The other, same 2 against, was a General Assembly resolution condemning the U.S. illegal economic warfare against Nicaragua. Now, why didn't it come up in the Security Council? Well, the reason is the Security Council had been disabled a couple of years earlier when it passed a resolution calling on all states to obey international law, not referring to the United States, but everybody understood what it meant, and that was vetoed by the United States, so that got rid of the Security Council. Actually, this incidentally continues. Another vote this time around, in which the U.S. and Israel again were alone, was against U.S. economic warfare against Cuba. 2 against, as usual. And this pattern is very traditional. It's standard. You recall the 50th anniversary line about how the UN was paralyzed by the Russian obstruction and vetoes and the grim-faced Soviet ambassadors. Well, here there's just data that you can look at. Since it's not easy to find, you got to search for it, but it's there. Since the 1960s, the U.S. is far in the lead in Security Council vetoes. In second place is the United Kingdom. A very distant third is France, and fourth are the grim-faced Soviet ambassadors. In the General Assembly, the story is about the same. Votes like 153 to 1 or 150 to 2 and so on are not at all rare, and that covers a whole range of issues, obeying international law, aggression, human rights, terrorism, and so on, and it's always the U.S. against. Those are the isolated votes. And a U.S. vote against in the General Assembly amounts to a veto, of course. Now, all of this is almost totally suppressed in the free press. I've reviewed it if you're interested, but it's almost never reported. It's not even in even in the mainstream scholarly literature you don't follow, but it's there. And worse, the press and journalism and a good deal of scholarship not only suppresses the actual facts, but repeats endless lies about it of the kind that I just reiterated. Well, that's something that ought to concern people who have who are worried about the nature of their country and the fate of their country. It tells us something about the culture that we're living in and something worthwhile. But instead of going on with that, let me go on to that's the Cold War. You can think about it. Let's take a look at the ethnic conflicts, that disillusioned us after the end of the Cold War. They're real. There are new ethnic conflicts, namely in the area where the imperial system collapsed. So where the Soviet Union collapsed, there are ethnic conflicts that were held under control by the tyrannical system, same in the Balkans. But that's hardly a new phase of world history that calls for deep thought from serious intellectuals. In fact, it's absolutely standard. It's standard and expected with the decline of any tyrannical system, always. Take, say, post-colonial Africa, when the imperial powers left, lots of ethnic conflicts. Or take, say, India and Palestine after the British withdrew, horrible ethnic conflicts. The last, most recent imperial system to collapse prior to the Soviet Union is the Portuguese Empire. That collapsed in 1975, and it led to very serious conflicts, ethnic conflicts, actually three primarily: Angola, Mozambique, and Timor. They're rarely discussed in the same context, but they belong in the same context. These are three ethnic conflicts that took off right at the time of the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in 1975, and they were serious. Time's short, and I won't talk about Mozambique and Angola, but let me just quote the conclusion by one of the leading Western historians of Africa, the British historian Basil Davidson. He says that those responsible for the Contra subversions against Angola and Mozambique will be cursed by history for enormous and terrible crimes which will long weigh heavily on the whole of southern Africa. He's referring to you and me, incidentally, if it's not obvious, and he's quite right, in fact, too kind, in fact. The UN Commission on Africa estimated that more than 1.5 million people were killed, and there were over $60 billion in damages in the Reagan years alone by way of South Africa with U.S. support. That's under the rubric of what was called constructive engagement. In Angola, it's continuing with horrible consequences. Well, let me turn to Timor, which is even more dramatic in a way. It's not a small matter, incidentally. It's the worst slaughter relative to population, the only reasonable measure since the Holocaust. And it's very clear and unambiguous, ethnic conflict. The worst case in post-war history, in fact. And also outright aggression on top of it. Now, it's true that the UN failed to stop it. This was a real failure of the UN. So therefore, we have to dismantle the UN until we take a look at what happened. What happened is that the U.S. role in implementing the invasion and the slaughter was decisive, both at the military level and at the diplomatic level. At the military level, the U.S. had been providing about 90% of the arms, and immediately after the invasion, Henry Kissinger, who now produces noble words about the United Nations at the meeting, he immediately, secretly enhanced the flow of arms to the aggressors. Jimmy Carter then stepped in a couple of years later. The Indonesian army was actually running out of arms in this war. And as the slaughters peaked in 1978, they became real genocidal. Carter increased the flow of arms to implement them. What about at the diplomatic level? Well, our ambassador was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and he's explained it in his memoirs, so I don't have to make it up. He writes in his memoirs that the State Department wanted things, that the United States wanted things to turn out as they did, and he was given the task of rendering the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it might do to impede the Indonesian aggression, and he said he carried this out with great success. And then he goes on in the next sentence to say, well, apparently within the next couple of weeks about 10% of the population was slaughtered, and then we go off to the next topic. So yeah, the United Nations failed. And in fact, it continued to fail for similar reasons. End result of all of this, Moynihan is lauded all over the place as the most courageous and leading exponent of international law and morality, a lone voice of honor at the United Nations. Carter's, soul of our foreign policy is human rights. Kissinger gives speeches at the UN, and so on. Again, tells us something about the intellectual culture in which we live. What about coverage of all of this? That's interesting, too. Pre-1975, believe it or not, Timor got a lot of coverage in the press. The reason was concern about the collapse of the Portuguese Empire and what it was going to mean. As the invasion took place with decisive U.S. military and diplomatic assistance, as it took place, coverage began to drop. By 1978, when the slaughter peaked, coverage reached zero, both in the United States and Canada, another leading investor in Indonesia. Later on, there were some changes in an interesting way. So by the 80s, there is coverage. And it has an interesting tone. It's a good thing that's there, sometimes even accurate, but it has an interesting tone to it. It's indicated by, say, headlines, an editorial in the New York Times called "The Shaming of Indonesia," or articles in the Washington Post by, say, James Fallows and others, saying, well, it's our mistake. We didn't do enough to stop the atrocities. Actually, we did more than enough. We implemented them. And it's not the shaming of Indonesia, it's the shaming of the United States and the shaming of the New York Times and so on. But that insight is inexpressible. It's no problem about our not doing enough. We did, as I've indicated and barely indicated, did plenty. Actually, they, in fact, made the decisive contribution. But that's inexpressible. That's not part of the possible culture. Now, there have been changes, important ones. One change is that popular opposition finally developed enough so that U.S. Congress did impose constraints on sending arms to Indonesia, which forced the Clinton administration to undertake all sorts of chicanery to evade the restrictions as it did. But that's important. There have also been significant changes in Indonesia. It's a lot harder to criticize things in Indonesia than it is here. Very much harder. But student organizations and independent intellectuals and human rights activists and labor leaders and so on have been openly and vocally condemning the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in the last couple of years, and also condemning the West, condemning us for refusing to join with them in doing so, and it's easy for us, and for refusing to join in their own struggles for internal democracy and human rights and labor rights in Indonesia. And for them to do it, I stress again, is a lot harder than for us to do it. That's heroic. Nothing for us to say that. Well, the end of the Portuguese Empire had consequences that are far worse than the end of the Soviet Empire. The end of the French Empire, still worse, led to Algeria into China with about 4 million people killed. There was a Cold War element, but pretty far at the margins. Suppose we look elsewhere, say at the Middle East. Well, take say Lebanon, the absolute symbol of ethnic conflict yesterday and still today. In fact, Lebanon hit the front pages recently, all of its horrible ethnic conflicts, right after the Oklahoma City bombings. Remember the headlines were, Oklahoma City looks like Beirut. Horrible. I mean, here's this horrible stuff coming back to haunt us right here. Real atrocity. It's true that Oklahoma City did look like Beirut, in fact, very much like it. Of course, Beirut has been looking like Beirut for some time. In particular, it looked like Beirut exactly 10 years before the Oklahoma City bombing, when the biggest car bomb in history went off, the worst terrorist act in the region in that peak year of terrorism, which was virtually identical with the Oklahoma City bombing. A bomb went off in right outside a mosque, a huge car bomb, timed to kill the maximum number of people when they were leaving, killing mostly women and children, babies slaughtered in their beds and that sort of thing, huge casualties. you remember that after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a lot of talk about how we're going to hunt the criminals to the end of the earth and bomb the Middle East if it's there and so on. Well, in the case of the Beirut bombing, just exactly 10 years earlier, all of that would be really easy. That is, assuming that the U.S. Air Force has the capacity to bomb Washington and California and Texas and places like that, because the bombing was organized by U.S. intelligence, by the CIA, and carried out with the assistance of British intelligence, so maybe there's a couple of bombs left for London too. Yesterday at the United Nations, Clinton's big announcement was that calling on everybody to aid us in the struggle against international terrorism and to find the criminals wherever they are and so on and so forth. Some other interesting things there, which I'll talk about if you like. There's no time. Yeah, that's pretty easy. We can certainly do it. No big problem. We know exactly where they are. There's incidentally no controversy about this, But oddly, somehow it was missed, And all the talk about Oklahoma City looking like Beirut, nobody was able to point out that there is, after all, a comparison. And if you want to look for international terrorists, we know where to look for them. It's not that the press didn't know about it. It was brought to their attention. I know myself because I did it lots of times. And some people tried to write about it and couldn't. The same was true in Britain, incidentally. So anyhow, yeah, Lebanon has a horrible place, and there are some interesting reasons why. The Middle East is also supposed to be a grand success in overcoming ethnic conflict, namely the Oslo agreements. I would like to talk about that, but there's no time right now. Again, I'll come back if you like. It's, again, very revealing what actually happened. What actually happened is the victory of a huge U.S. power play in which the United States for about 20 years has stood alone against the rest of the world, alone in blocking a diplomatic settlement, and has now rammed through its own rejectionist position. The U.S. blocked the United Nations, vetoed Security Council resolutions, voting every year. There were votes like 150 to 2 at the General Assembly to block any diplomatic settlement because the U.S. insisted on two things. One, no rights for the Palestinians, and the rest of the world wouldn't agree to this, and the U.S. insisted on no withdrawal, except as they decide, and the world wouldn't agree with this. It's only after 1990 when the U.S., after the world capitulated. In fact, with the big effect of the Gulf War was the world capitulated and said, okay, you run it yourself. And then we had a genuine peace process, namely a peace process run unilaterally by the United States with nobody interfering and ramming through the rejectionist position of the United States, which it had held against the rest of the world. All of this is documented beyond any question. The facts are not in doubt, and it's undetectable. You got to go way deep in the memory hole, even in scholarship, to dig out the facts. Again, a great success of propaganda and an explanation of why the headlines read Day of Awe at the White House a week or two ago. Yeah, it was a day of awe, but not exactly for what they were talking about. Well, let me finally return to attitudes toward the United Nations. There's a lot of self-righteous commentary about its failings. I've given some indication of why and where I think it's failed. In my opinion, what has happened is exactly what was predictable, namely on realist grounds. The lion's share of the responsibility for the failure falls, not surprisingly, on the world's most powerful state, which has been, in fact, rendering the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it did, exactly as our ambassador and leading exponent of international law was kind enough to tell us that he did in the case of the worst slaughter since the Holocaust. And that's dramatically been true since the early 1960s. What happened then was that the United Nations fell under what's called here the tyranny of the majority, which is also sometimes known as democracy, and it just stopped following orders. As soon as it stopped following orders, down the tube. We then render it utterly ineffective in anything it's going to do. The commentary on all of this is quite amazing. I sampled a bit of it. A lot of it's in print. It's a pretty remarkable story. Well, what about the principle that explains U.S. attitudes toward the UN, the ones that are articulated in our culture, the intellectual culture? I think if you check, you'll find that the explanation is extremely simple. Insofar as the United Nations followed the orders of Churchill's rich men in the rich societies, which means primarily the United States, exactly to that extent it was praised. insofar as it didn't follow those orders, it was condemned. That's a pretty simple principle, and it accounts with remarkable precision for all the variations in attitudes. Again, I'll go through more of it if you like, and there's a lot in print, but I think that's the way it is. Well, that, I'm afraid, these are some of the issues that lie behind the fashion, some of the realities behind the illusions, and if they continue to be kept in the shadows, that is, if Churchillian realism continues to prevail in the coming world order, we can praise ourselves and our colleagues and our friends and our institutions for the achievement. Thanks.
You've been watching a From the Archives lecture by MIT professor of linguistics, Noam Chomsky, The Contours of World Order, 50 Years of the United Nations. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from this program. Noam Chomsky is world-renowned for his revolutionary work in the fields of linguistics and philosophy. From the early days of dissent against the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, Noam Chomsky became widely known for his analysis and criticism of United States foreign policy. He has published hundreds of articles and dozens of books. At the time of this lecture, October 1995, he had most recently published Year 501, The Conquest Continues, and World Orders, Old and New. His most recent books include Hegemony and Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, and Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. For more information about Noam Chomsky and his work, please visit the Noam Chomsky website at www.chomsky.info. And now we return to the question and answer session from our program, The Contours of World Order, 50 Years of the United Nations.
Actually, if I can have one more minute, there's something I really feel bad about. The President yesterday made an eloquent appeal to people to help him out, and since I've been talking about following orders, I'd like to perform my duties as a citizen and respond to the President's request. You can read it in the front pages of today's papers, and it's not quite what I was talking about, but closely relevant. Apart from the appeal for everyone to search out the international terrorists and pursue them to the corners of the earth and so on, which is easy, as I mentioned, easy ways to start on that. There was another thing equally dramatic. He called a national emergency because of an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States, and he called on everyone, all nations and everyone, to join with us in the task that he announced, which is the following: to identify any nation, person, or company, business, engaged in money laundering or playing a significant role in drug trafficking centered in Colombia. And all such nations and companies and businesses will be banned from operations in the United States, and please help him out. So here's some help in identifying him. There was a major study done by the OECD a couple of years ago. That's the Organization of the Rich Countries. They tried to trace money laundering. Not so easy because it's illegal, but they tried to trace it, and their conclusion is that over half of it goes through U.S. banks. Colombia gets about 7% of it, according to them. Now, that's not a secret. It was published in the major national daily in Mexico, however, Excelsior. I don't think it was ever reported here. That's the organization, utterly reputable organization of the big rich countries, and it tells you one good place to start in trying to close down anybody who's involved in money laundering. Over 50% sounds like a good place to start. Second, are there any companies involved in playing a significant role in drug trafficking? Well, yeah. During the Reagan administration years, the CIA and congressional investigators did an analysis of chemical flows to Latin America from American chemical companies, and discovered that they were far in excess of any possible industrial needs, and that in fact, the chemicals that were flowing down there are exactly the ones that are being used for manufacturing cocaine in Colombia. So there's another way to shut down businesses that are doing business, because here, though they have a significant role in the Drug racket, namely start with the big American chemical corporations, which again ought to be pretty easy. But what about nations that are involved in playing a significant role in drug trafficking in Colombia? Well, a good place to start is to look at those who are funding the traffickers. Now, it's well known. You can read it in every Human Rights Watch report, and Amnesty International report, and Church Study, and so on. It's pretty well known who they are, mostly the military. The military and the security forces are up to their necks in league with the drug traffickers and the paramilitary and the landowners who have given Colombia the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, again, documenting a whole flow of documents on this from all the international human rights groups and church groups, and they're getting funded, namely by us. In fact, they get more than about half of U.S. military aid to Latin America goes to them. It has nothing to do with the drug war, but except insofar as we're funding people who are involved in it. It has a lot to do with killing peasants and things like that. But that's half of U.S. military aid. Actually, it's increasing under Clinton. So it's pretty easy to identify the nations and major corporations and banks and financial institutions that are engaged in money laundering and drug trafficking in Colombia. Well, we'll have a test. Presumably all of this will be headlines in the Free Press tomorrow, so I'm just giving you a foretaste. But in any event, there's an easy way for all of us to help out in the President's appeal if we want. Okay, your turn.
Thank you for coming out on this trip, Professor Chomsky, and thanks to the groups who sponsored your trip here as well. My question regards nuclear weapons policy in the United States in the post-Cold War era. My understanding is that pretty much a year ago there was a nuclear posture review conducted by the administration, and the decision was to continue a policy of nuclear deterrence as a result of that review. The specific question I have is regarding the nuclear weapons establishment subsidizing the high-tech corporate sector in the continuation of the development of very sophisticated replacement components for nuclear weapons systems in the years to come. Specifically, the Intel Corporation, which is now moving to the neighboring county north of us, has an R&D facility which is involved with a contract with Department of Energy to develop a new supercomputing system which will be able to do simulation and modeling of very precise physics of nuclear detonations. So that, in conjunction with the proposed National Ignition Facility in California, seems to continue the policy of sophisticated weapons development.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What impacts does this have for future directions for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for the Comprehensive Test Ban, and for an eventual nuclear weapons convention banning nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War era? Could you address that?
Yeah, I think the answer is pretty obvious. There is a shift in nuclear weapons policy. There's a shift towards, a lot of stuff they don't tell us, but from the public record, there's a shift towards, sort of lower, more sophisticated and precise and lower yield targeted weapons. And there's even a public posture about this. It was announced in right after the fall of the Berlin. Every year, the White House gives Congress a statement about why the Pentagon has to be bigger than it ever was in history. And it's usually, for all through the Cold War, it was the same statement. The monolithic and ruthless conspiracy, we got to defend ourselves and so on. And the bottom line, more weapons, more nuclear weapons and so on. Well, the interesting one to look at was March 1990. The Russians are gone, no Russian bear. If you look at the posture statement, it was, the bottom line was the same as before. Bigger Pentagon, maintain the military industrial base and so on and so forth, but the argument was different. No Russians. In fact, they even said that our main intervention, this is before the Gulf War, our main intervention forces have to continue to be targeted to the Middle East, where the threat to our interest could not be laid at the Kremlin's door, contrary to the lies of previous years. But there was a threat, namely what they called the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's the threat all of a sudden. So we have to maintain the same system because of the technological sophistication of third world powers, which at least is getting closer to the truth. All of this is a system of world control. And if the Russians aren't there, well, let's be more honest. So the clouds are kind of lifting, and I think the weapons policy is shifting in that direction. There's another comment that's worth making about weapons policy, and here, just let me suggest an inquiry to you. There's a good question. I mean, you used the word deterrence, and that's the word that's used, but there's a fair question. One should ask, were the weapons designed for defending us? Well, you know, you can sort of check that. You can look at the threats that the United States faced, and there have been some, and ask what response there was to them. So say go back to around 1950. I mean, the U.S. was the most secure country in the history of the world, you know, controlled the whole hemisphere, controlled both oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans, you know, had a huge military apparatus. I mean, it's just, there's no level of security remotely like it, but there was a potential at that time. The potential threat to the United States was intercontinental missiles with high yield, meaning hydrogen bomb warheads. So now the records are out. Take a look and see how much attention was given to relieving that threat. Answer, it never even came up, meaning the one threat that there really was of absolutely no concern to anyone. Now, you know, could negotiations have been carried out that would have prevented that threat? Well, you don't know, you know, until they were tried, and they weren't going to be tried because basically nobody cared. And if you check the story, you'll find that runs through to the end. Like take, say, the Reagan years. The biggest military threat to the United States in the Reagan years was sea-launched cruise missiles. The United States has long coastlines. You know, submarines can come right up to the coastline. Cruise missiles are very precise. They can carry nuclear weapons. So that's a real threat to the United States. No threat to Russia. They don't have coastlines. But it's a big threat to us. So ask yourself how the Reagan administration strategists handled sea-launched cruise missiles. They wanted them extended. They wanted to block any negotiations that might stop them. And in fact, that story runs quite consistently all the way through, which again suggests that something else is going on. And I think we see what else is going on even more clearly now when we look at the shift of weapons policy. About the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I mean, obviously, as long as the major powers, meaning mainly us, but you know, Britain and France, are going to hold on to nuclear weapons, and as long as our kind of client states do, like Israel with our support, incidentally, sure, it's going to. Non-proliferation treaty is going to work just insofar as you can beat people over the head. You know, and so one thing you might keep an eye on is a proposal coming to the World Court. The World Health Organization, about 2 years ago, I guess, voted to ask the World Court for an advisory opinion on the legality of keeping nuclear weapons. The Western powers were passionately opposed to this. They've tried in every way to prevent the World Court from hearing this. They went as far, the United States went as far as threatening Indonesia with sanctions, like not for, you know, invading East Timor and killing off a large part, that's okay, but because Indonesia was planning to propose to the World Court pass a resolution on from the non-aligned countries saying, yeah, they'd like to hear the World Court opinion on this. That was going to call for sanctions. Well, you know, it's still coming up. I think it's still being discussed. It's very hard to learn anything about it, you know, because it's never reported. But it's in process now, and that could be of some interest. It's, of course, an opinion of the World Court, and the rich and powerful don't pay any attention to it if they don't feel like, as the Nicaragua case showed. But nevertheless, it's another step towards trying to, which can be used to try to get people to understand what all this stuff is about. But you know, other than that, I think things are going in a very dangerous direction.
A quick question and ask you for a comment, ask you for a response. You referred to the preemptive strikes used by the United States. One in the early 60s was used at a place called the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and one of the gentlemen who helped repel that preemptive strike, as you indicated, has now grabbed a much bigger share of the world stage than President Clinton felt like sharing at the United Nations this weekend. And I wanted to point out that a couple of months ago in Cuba, there was a demonstration, about 500,000 people to support the Cuban Revolution, one of those little facts that also doesn't climb into the daily newspapers in the United States very often. In 1989, there were all kinds of predictions that Fidel Castro would be going the way of Ceausescu and others in Eastern Europe. All of that has turned out really to be not true. And the Cuban people have asked for help from people in the United States and elsewhere in trying to fight against this criminal embargo that, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps you can correct me, is the longest embargo of its type carried out by any country in the world against any other country. So I wonder if you could say a word or two about that, and I would just like to tell everyone that if you're interested in doing anything to fight that embargo, there is literature and information at one of the tables outside. Thank you.
Yeah, it's by far the longest. Also, economic warfare embargoes, which are completely illegal. The United States is way in the lead. The third world, the South, the non-aligned countries, actually tabled a resolution at the United Nations about 2 or 3 years ago, calling on the General Assembly to ban the practice of economic embargoes, which are, and of course, big powers would never even let it get to a discussion. It's been condemned by the World Court in the case of Nicaragua. In the case of Cuba, you take a look at the last vote at the UN. Not only in previous votes about the embargo, the U.S. had gotten more than its automatic one vote. It had also gotten Albania 1 year, and it got Romania 1 year. But this year, Albania and Romania dropped off, so it's just the U.S. and Israel, which means the U.S. It's one vote alone. Furthermore, very interesting was the discussion about it. Even U.S. allies, loyal U.S. allies, usually pretty craven U.S. allies like Britain, were bitterly condemning the embargo. And it has nothing to do with your attitude toward Castro. It's a totally separate issue. And the U.S. is, in fact, tightening it, making it worse. Interestingly, the U.S. business community is now split on the issue. On the same principle as Vietnam. I mean, torturing people makes some sense, but making profits makes more sense. And if the two things come into conflict, then there's two values that have to be considered, and one might prevail over the other. As to, the practice ought to be considered intolerable. Like nobody puts embargoes on the United States. It's a practice that can be carried out by the powerful against people they want to hurt. And that's exactly why the vast majority of the world's population, through the non-aligned countries, have wanted to ban it, and it's exactly why we're the leading, well in the lead. And it's completely illegal, under GATT rules, under international law, and so on. It goes on as long as we let it.
In the beginning of your talking, you talked about daring to speak truth about power. And obviously what you're saying wakes up a lot of people, and I'm just wondering what protects you from being one of the many people that just vanishes. Very
simple. I'm white, I'm privileged, I'm part of the wealthy classes. There's no such thing as a capitalist country in the world. It couldn't survive for a second, but this one is sort of more toward the capitalist end of the spectrum than most. And the more you are toward that end of the spectrum, the more everything becomes a commodity, of which you get about as much of as you can buy. Well, here, freedom is a commodity. If you're rich enough and the right color and everything else, you can buy a lot of it. And I'm rich enough and privileged enough, so I have a lot of it. In fact, the people who would protect, like I was a black organizer in the ghetto, maybe I'd get killed. It's happened. But the people who really have power in this country would not want the state to be powerful enough to go after people like me, because if so, they would go after people like them. So civil rights are indeed protected under the condition that freedom is a commodity that you can purchase, like shoes. And there is a lot of it. This is a very free society. And there are a lot of people like us who are pretty privileged, and we have an awful lot of freedom to do things. If we don't do them, it's our fault, because there's no cost. If there's any cost, it's pretty slight. Not like most places in the world. It's not like protesting in Indonesia, for example, or in Central America. You're not going to get your brains blown out like Jesuits in El Salvador, and that just gives us more responsibility.
I want to draw some references to your earlier statements about nerve gas and international terrorism, with the use of chemicals that are being put in our food and our clothing and our cleaning products, You could smell it when you walked in here today when the rugs were rolled out, and tobacco and our medicines ad infinitum. And we're seeing it in the statistics most recently told us about the high numbers of children in New York with the astronomical levels of respiratory problems. These manufacturers, it is an international terrorism, and they're killing themselves as well as everybody. I kind of see it doesn't matter whether we have education or money in the future. I think we're all going to be too sick to go to work and produce much, and the numbers of chemical sensitivities cases are at least being recognized today, but are being recognized in big numbers. I'd like you to comment on that.
It's a serious problem, but I think we should be clear about it. It's mostly a problem of poverty. People like us may suffer somewhat, but not a lot. The people who are really going to get it in the neck are the ones who are poorer here and, of course, in the third world. So just take, say, tobacco. Tobacco is a very dangerous drug. In terms of the number of people killed, it's like, I think the latest figures I saw is about 100 times as high in the United States as all hard drugs combined. As compared to marijuana, I'm sure is not good for you, but I don't think there's a single known overdose from death from overdose in marijuana after, 60, 70 million users. Plenty of deaths from tobacco. So it's and furthermore, tobacco is different from other drugs in that it harms other people. Like if I smoke, it harms you, and the costs are very high, but they're not much here. They're going down here, especially, by now smoking is mostly a class issue here. So if you look at you just look at the statistics on smoking, it's not totally, but by and large, the sort of, as you go towards, as wealth goes up, smoking goes down very considerably. It's become sort of a class issue. On the other hand, there are other parts of the world where smoking is going way up with aggressive U.S. intervention at the very same time that George Bush announced the drug war, same month, in fact. The U.S. Trade Commission was conducting hearings on sanctions against Thailand and South Korea, which passed, because they were not permitting aggressive advertising of U.S. lethal narcotics, namely tobacco, aimed mostly at women and children. So here's, all kind of hysterical talk about Noriega and the drug war on the one hand. On the other hand, we're using state power to force women and children there to smoke more and more so that more and more can be killed. Incidentally, the press wouldn't cover this either. It was hard to avoid. The Surgeon General of the United States, Everett Koop, properly conservative, was outraged about it and tried to get some attention, and nobody could do it. He said it was like the Opium Wars. Nobody would report it. The scale of that is substantial. There's a well-known epidemiologist in Oxford University who really recently tried to do an estimate on what the cost was going to be to China of the aggressive marketing of tobacco there, mostly to young people. And, his estimate, for what it's worth, was that of people now under 20, I think that was the number. I think he said about 50 million were going to die from the effects of tobacco. That's fairly substantial killing, even by 20th century standards. And it is very much kind of, it's not uniform, but it's highly correlated with privilege and opportunities. And I think the same is true if you look across the board. Yeah, you're right. These things are going to harm everybody, but not equally.
I hope you'll forgive me if I ask a question that should probably be a lecture in itself, but I think a lot of people probably came here expecting to hear some kind of solution or looking for solutions. And I was wondering if you could address this kind of a three-part thing. Like personal solutions that you've participated in. Like I believe I read in an introduction to one of your books that you participated in the early Zionist movement, which was an anarchist sort of socialist movement, and also in the 60s as well. And also, if you could address what most people here are young intellectuals who want affect change in society in the way an intellectual can sort of break with their class privilege. And third, a lot of people leaning towards the anarchist bent of solutions have a very hard problem dealing with organization. Like less organization is seen as like a more bigger solution. And to me, I can't see us being like too organized, but it's more the type of organization that's at question. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping you could address maybe some of the solutions you've participated in that were not hierarchical.
Okay, just first of all to clarify, it's true that I was pretty active as a teenager in the Zionist movement. In fact, remained so for a long time. But it was anything but an anarchist movement. It was a nationalist movement which had this is in the early before the state was established, and it had various wings. And there was a kind of a libertarian socialist wing, and that's the part I was interested in. But by 1948, that was essentially dead. In fact, that part of the Zionist movement was opposed to a Jewish state. It was part of the Zionist mainstream at the time, because the idea of a Jewish state is a fairly recent one. It was even opposed by the leadership until about 1942. But that's a different story. I don't want to go into that whole thing. As far as things that can be done, there's tons of them. I mean, take, say, East Timor, which I just mentioned. If for about 50, this is not a small thing. It's the worst slaughter since the Holocaust relative to the population. And for a long time, you just could not talk about it. The number of people involved, there's kind of like a dozen people, maybe, mostly young, who were involved in it. I can name them, if you like. And you just couldn't break through, zero. Well, the last couple of years it changed. I mean, it got to the point where there's a considerable protest, and it's mutually supportive. Like protest here relates to protest in Australia, and they're mutually stimulative, and to England, and even Indonesia. Now, the Indonesian protests don't get reported here, but they do get reported in Australia. And if we could do it, we could report it here, and that's important. And that made a big change. It made such a significant change that by now there is actually a possibility that Indonesia might withdraw and allow self-determination. When the U.S. changes policy, the world listens, because this is a big thug, and everybody knows it except educated people here. And if it changes policy on something, everybody listens, including Indonesia. So there's something that was done by a very small number of people who had a tremendous effect for, if you count the number of hours that were put in and the number of lives that were saved, it's extraordinary. Or take, say, the Indochina War. I mean, it's true that it ended up killing about 4 million people, but the U.S. did not use nuclear weapons. It didn't totally destroy all the countries of the region, just mostly. Well, that's because a lot of people struggled against it. Or take, say, Central America. The biggest popular movement of, I think, post-Second World War, it's never talked about in the press, but it certainly was there, was the Central America Solidarity Movement, way beyond anything that existed in the 60s. And very not only spread, but pretty deeply rooted in mainstream American society, whereas the movement of the 60s was kind of marginal. It was enormous. I mean, churches, it was much stronger in the Midwest and Southwest than it was in places like, say, Boston campuses. And it was very effective. I mean, the Reagan administration tried to duplicate Kennedy. Kennedy just attacked South Vietnam in 1961, just sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing it. It's not part of our official history, but it happened. The Reagan administration tried to duplicate that in 1981, and in fact announced it with a white paper very similar to Kennedy's, who was their model. And there was such popular reaction, they had to back off and resort to international terrorism instead of direct aggression. Well, international terrorism is harmful, but direct aggression is a lot more harmful. So that's a big, it's not pretty what happened, but could have been a lot worse. And you can go across the board. I mean, the more we can do, the more we can change things. I don't think there's any secrets. I'm not spending any time on it because I think it's obvious. If you recognize our responsibilities, which are great, and our options, which are enormous, instantly you can think of all kinds of things that can be done, whether it's Colombia or Timor or Africa or wherever you like. Just think about it for 2 minutes and you'll think of things that can be done. Now, as for anarchists and organization, anarchism covers a lot of things, but I don't, and I've always been much interested in it and engaged in it and committed to it, but I don't think there's any conflict between anarchism and organization. At least the parts of the anarchist movement that I've been interested in were looking for a highly organized society, but organized from below. Organization doesn't mean hierarchy and authority. That's something else. But if people get together to run things and they federate with others and they make voluntary associations maybe across the planet, that could be an extremely high level of organization, and it's on anarchist principles. So I don't see any conflict between anarchism and organization. In fact, I think anarchism is calling for a highly organized society, but a popularly and democratically organized one.
I just want to invite people who are interested in discussing these issues. I've got some flyers for a magazine that I'm putting together on these issues, if you're interested too.
I noticed McNamara came out with a new book on Vietnam, and I was wondering if you would comment on what the U.S. relation to Vietnam is at this current moment, as well as what is the current political, economic situation inside of the country.
Well, I won't. I've written about McNamara's book if you're interested, so I won't comment any further. It was quite interesting. What was interesting about it was that there isn't the discussion about it was what was most interesting. The question was, did he go too far in apologizing, or was it right that he did it? And the people in the peace movement said, let's honor him for apologizing, and others said, no, he went too far. Fact of the matter is, there is not a word of apology in the book, except to Americans. He apologizes to Americans for what he did to American society. There is not a word of apology for the 4 million corpses that he left there in 3 destroyed countries. That is beyond discussion, and it's amazing to me that activists in the peace movement and religious leaders and so on were praising this as an apology to everybody except the victims. The fact that that could happen, tells you something quite astonishing about the culture again. And there's more to say about the book, but I won't go into it. As to the U.S. and Vietnam, well, long story, but what happened, in my opinion, back around 1970, I thought the U.S. had basically won the war. The big threat, nobody was ever worried about Vietnam conquering Indonesia and, Hawaii and all that stuff. That was for, to frighten the public. What they were worried about was the usual thing, the demonstration effect of successful independent development. And it was part of a broader concern about China and so on, and that's pretty clear in the internal documentary record. I thought it was sort of obvious by 1970, but with the release of the Pentagon Papers, it became quite well documented over 20 years ago. And in fact, by about 1970, it was clear there was never going to be any demonstration effect. In fact, the countries would be lucky to survive. This is a huge assault by a superpower. It'd be lucky if they could survive at all, but they certainly weren't going to be a model for anybody. In fact, one effect, which I thought was, again, I wrote about it in 1970, was pretty obvious then, was that either the place would be totally wiped out, or else what would survive would be the harshest and toughest elements, because they're the only ones that can survive that kind of an assault. Well, it's pretty much what happened. I didn't predict the Khmer Rouge, but it's generally what happened. So I thought the U.S. had basically won a victory in terms of its actual war aims. Well, I still think so. Actually, the business press more or less agreed. Like the Far Eastern Economic Review a couple of years later said, look, why don't you guys call off? You've won already. They're never going to bother us. We've put up dictatorships all in the neighborhood, so no virus is going to infect anybody, and you crushed this one, so no virus, and go on to something more productive. Okay, then comes 1975. The U.S. escalated the war, but in a different way, turned it into strangulation. The idea after 1975 was to make the victory, to deepen the victory, make sure that they don't have a chance of recovering. So put a heavy economic embargo on, block the international lending institutions from giving them assent, make them really suffer and starve. Exactly what we're doing to Nicaragua right now. Nicaragua is going down like that, It's now the second poorest country in the hemisphere, right after Haiti. We got a stranglehold on it. We are not going to let it develop. We are now insisting that they return basically the Somoza properties and so on. Hillary Clinton was just there praising the Chamorro government for reuniting the Nicaraguan family and rejuvenating the economy since democracy came in 1990. A couple of days before she was there, the ultra-right paper of the business community, La Tribuna, which is, super neoliberal and everything else, published a story on a UNICEF report on Nicaragua, which has yet to make it here and never will, which was headlines something like, Nicaragua mortgaging its future by the fact that the child malnutrition, the starvation is out of sight and everything's collapsing and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's the revitalization of the Nicaraguan economy. We got a stranglehold on it, and they got to suffer. Same with Cuba. And there's reasons for that, too. Just imagine yourself in the position of, say, the mafia don who runs a certain neighborhood. So you're running a certain neighborhood. Suppose somebody doesn't pay protection money. Do you just go in and get the money? No. You send goons in to, break his legs and beat him to a pulp and make a model so that others understand that you follow orders. Okay? Now, again, people in the world understand this, but if you're well-educated like us, you don't see it. So it kind of looks odd that every time anybody gets out of line and we've won, we go on and torture them. Yeah, it makes complete sense. In fact, we wouldn't have the slightest problem understanding it in the case of, say, the mafia don in the neighborhood. And that's us, we're the mafia don for the world. Sure, it makes a lot of sense. And in fact, the U.S. kept the stranglehold on it. The excuses kept changing. So at first we had the missing in action story was concocted, a total fraud. Nobody ever cared about missing in action before, there's still people who haven't been found from the War of 1812. We don't have any problem digging up the bodies. There are bodies all over Flanders Field, which nobody's cared about. Nobody bothers with them. Same for every war. But this was a good way to get people upset, behind the idea of strangling Vietnam. Then, fortunately, something else came along. Vietnam invaded Cambodia and put an end to the Pol Pot regime's atrocities. And since the U.S. was in fact supporting Pol Pot, they were bitterly attacked. This is the one humanitarian intervention that I know of in modern history. It's not that they were trying to be humanitarian. That was just a consequence of it, was to put an end to a major massacre. So they came under huge attack. The Prussians of Asia, we got to strangle them and so on. That went across the propaganda system without a whisper. And we started openly supporting Pol Pot, the Democratic Kampuchea Coalition, and now we had to embargo Vietnam because the Prussians of Asia had put an end to the Pol Pot regime. Okay, then they withdrew from Cambodia. Without missing a beat, we shifted back to missing in action. Now we got to strangle them because of missing in action. And this continued until a couple of years ago, and then it stopped for a very simple reason. Most of the world listens when the United States gives orders, but it was starting to leak. Japan was starting to invest, and Europe was starting to invest, and so on. And American business just didn't like the idea that they were being cut out of lucrative markets. So we had exactly the conflict which is now showing up in Cuba. Makes perfect sense to torture people, teaches people a good lesson, and so on, but at some point the need to make profits is more important. So Vietnam is now allowed back into the civilized world on our terms. And that'll sooner or later happen with Nicaragua too, if anything's left of the place. Nicaragua may be uninhabitable in 10 or 20 years. It's possible. But that's the way you treat people who get out of line. And I think that's exactly what's going on in the Cuba case right now and the Nicaragua case. Incidentally, much the same is true of Iraq, which is another story. But
Professor Chomsky, last night you alluded to some of the impact that some of the newer investment options that transnationals have, like Eurodollar investments, are doing to the speculation economy. I was hoping that you could perhaps articulate more of the impact on the real economy when that money is essentially strip mined from it and playing in the larger global casino.
Well, it's late, but instead of my trying to say anything, let me just quote an absolutely impeccable source. Paul Volcker, who was the head of the Federal Reserve under Reagan and so on, very super respectable, just headed a commission which was looking into the decline of the growth rate since the 1970s. There's been a general decline in the growth rate around the industrial world since the 1970s. And they concluded that about 50% of the decline could be attributed just to the shift of capital to speculation against currencies. And it's pretty well understood why. I mean, it's a weapon against growth. Anytime any country starts to undertake policies that might stimulate the economy, capital flows from it. So it's a weapon against growth. And their estimate, for what it's worth, is about 50% of the decline in the growth rate is attributable to it. I don't have an independent judgment.
Yeah, thanks for coming again, and especially all these people here. This is quite the turnout. You don't get to see that in Olympia very much, so it's an honor to everyone here and show up. I wanted to say three things. One had to do with international law and indigenous issues and corporate colonialism and how that rates in the Western Hemisphere especially, but I know it's global. Second thing is about the International Court of Public Opinion. And the third would be on the what to do question. And I think that fits nicely into what was said earlier a little bit, is that, and one of the things I've heard you say, I've been listening for years, is that inform yourselves, inform each other, identify allies, and get out there and work on it. And one of the things I'd ask too, when we get to that part. But on indigenous issues and corporate colonialism, I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit. I know that it's a little bit lacking in some of your public talks. I know that you do get into it, and I know that the book 501 Years relates to that to a degree. But if you could speak to that, especially as regards regionally, we've been looking at a situation in British Columbia whereby that empire is on, it's beyond the treaty frontier. There's no treaties in most of what is now BC. And the native nations and peoples there have been in a very strong resistance. There was a 30-day siege that was blacked out of the U.S. It's very recent. And then also the BC Treaty Commission, which in terms of international law, I think is really an interesting concept that, you know, if we're going to believe in NAFTA and GATT and the rule of law and constitutions and parliaments, you know, how is Canada getting away with this and with its reputation? Mm-hmm. And in terms of the International Court of Public Opinion, I think a lot of the people here will pretty much always, you know, agree with a lot of what you have to say on detailing history for us and bringing us up to speed. But at the same time, I find more intriguing is your talk on mind control and what we can do about it and how people are really being manipulated or not and what we can do about that. So in terms of the International Court of Public Opinion, you know, why did we all see the person at Tiananmen Square standing in front of the tanks? You know, we all got that, yet is there any hopes in that regard? So maybe you could tie that into the what to do, those couple of things. Thanks.
Well, let me begin with the end. You know, what to do, there can't be any answer about what to do. That's like saying, look, people are suffering all over, what should we do? You know, well, there's no answer at that level. Ask, what should you do about X? You know, let's pick a problem. Then we can ask, what do we do about that problem? And then we'll ask, well, what are our capacities? You know, what's the problem? How can we deal with it? And so on and so forth. That's how you answer what can we do questions. You can talk about a bigger vision, like the person who asked the question over there about anarchism and organization. Yeah, you can think about long-term aims that you're trying to get to, and that makes sense too. But just what can we do? No, I mean, suppose people say, what should we do about slavery? Well, get rid of it, you know. Now, how do we get rid of it? Okay, now it becomes a problem, and you get serious and you try to do something about it. But general discussions about what can we do, they don't mean anything. You know, we've got enormous options. We're very free. Most of us are very privileged. You know, there's a high degree of responsibility here for what happens in the world. So there's a ton of things we can do if we choose to do them. We want to talk about it, then if we decide it's more fun to talk about it, well, then nothing will change. As to manipulation and what you can do about manipulation, yeah, stop letting yourself fall for it. I mean, again, there's no big secret, you know. You have to learn, which isn't all that hard, to take a skeptical, critical eye to the kind of stuff that you see and, you know, think about it and look at it from other points of view and so on. I mean, it's like asking, you know, if I'm teaching a science class and somebody says, how do I figure out the truth? I don't know, what can you say? I mean, you try to use your mind. That's what you have a mind for. You know, you try to be critical. I mean, maybe an experiment comes out this way, it doesn't look quite right. You look at it another way and so on and so forth. There's no techniques, you know. There's no techniques for finding out the truth about things, except having a critical intelligence and using it. And if you're looking for secrets, you're going to be very disappointed. There aren't any. At least nobody's ever found them. About indigenous issues, I can't say anything about British Columbia, I just don't know what the facts are. But international law is extremely weak on these issues. On the other hand, there's plenty of cases of national law, like the U.S., for example, I don't know the Canadian situation, but the United States, back since the 18th century, has had binding treaties with one or another indigenous group, which it has violated in the most extraordinary fashion over and over again, because power is one thing and binding treaties are another thing. And how can you implement the binding treaties? Well, again, by the public insisting on it. The public and the powerful part of the society, that's us. Also, I wouldn't, right now, the question of what the legality is of the treaties that were made with the Cherokees for the Southeast United States is kind of academic. But there are real issues about what rights people should have right now, and those should be addressed independently of any formal question of treaties or international law, in my opinion. I think last question. Yeah. No one wants to go to Portland.
The last question. All right, Noam, I guess I'll hit you with this big concept one here. Basically, I'd like you to describe the conflict between autarky, which is regional self-determination, and the New World Order. And specifically, I guess I'll go back to Africa here, and before East Timor, in a country that's now known as Burkina Faso, which means literally standing tall. It was named that by its revolutionary leader who took money away from the center of power in his country and gave it to the farmers, gave them more money to grow food, basically become more self-sufficient. And he was suppressed by the French colonialists and deposed very shortly thereafter by his vice president. But I'd like you to talk. Yeah. I'd like you to, what's that?
I think he's saying you better wrap it up.
Yeah. Well, I'd like you to just talk about that and also about what your vision of libertarian socialism and that specific thing.
It's more than I can manage in the 1 minute. But on the questions of regional self-determination and integration in the world economy, I'm afraid that there are no simple answers at a general abstract level. You have to look at the cases. So the problems of some country, in Africa, say, and Haiti are just different, and they have to be looked at on their own terms, which is not easy, and there's no formula. By and large, it's going to come down to the same thing. Any country is going to be able to follow a path of more or less independent self-development to the extent that the rich and powerful allow them to get away with it. Now, that happens to be mostly us, which means we have a big influence on this. Like Latin America could, in 1945, at the foundation of the United Nations, it could have followed what it was calling the philosophy of the new nationalism that was sweeping the region, meaning development for domestic needs, on the principle that the prime beneficiaries of a country's resources should be the people of that country, and so on. The U.S. didn't let them. Now, American citizens were just not involved in that. They didn't know what was going on. In fact, I suspect 99.9% of them still don't know what was going on 50 years ago, and don't associate the extraordinary inequality of Latin America, which is the highest in the world, and the huge capital flight and everything else, with the fact that we had some very definite decisions there, and it played a big role there for 50 years. But the same thing is true now, and we got to learn about those things and what we're doing and how we can change and how it affects us and how it affects other people, but there's no formula. It's a matter of looking at hard cases and coming up with analyses and understanding and then trying to do something about it. And I just don't know how to answer there's no answers at this level of generality.
One simple thing. 20 years ago, there was an energy crisis. What has happened to it now?
There was no energy crisis.
Well, in terms of in terms of where fossil fuels are heading into the future, there is an energy crisis.
Okay, look.
And how come it's being totally ignored by intellectuals?
It's not being totally ignored. There's a ton of people interested in it and concerned about it. And exactly what should be done about fossil fuels is a hard question. So, for example, say the question of nuclear energy. Here I disagree with a lot of my friends, I should say. I don't think that's a moral question. I think it's a technical question, basically. I mean, whether nuclear energy is more or less harmful than fossil fuels or, say, no energy, those are technical questions. It is not a moral issue, and you got to be serious about it. And the same is true of fusion. Whether fusion is an option and what its consequences might be is not a moral issue, It's a technical issue. Now, a technical issue has human consequences, significant human consequences, so it's in that sense a moral issue, like any technical issue is, has huge consequences. But you can't take a stand on it on moral grounds, I don't like it or something. You have to take a stand on it by asking, well, what are the consequences of the various choices that are open to us? And there are choices. Like one choice is to, say, give up use of energy, but then you have to ask what happens. Like, does that mean genocide of 5 billion people, or does it mean something else? Well, those are questions which unfortunately you have to take seriously, And the same is true of all of these questions. They are not easy, and it doesn't make any sense to have slogans about them. You've got to think them through.
You've been watching a From the Archives lecture by MIT Professor of Linguistics, Noam Chomsky. The Contours of World Order, 50 Years of the United Nations. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions. To find out more about this program and our many other video and audio programs, all available through free internet streaming, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find programs featuring such speakers as Paul Krugman, Phyllis Bennis, P. Synoth, Susan Faludi, Bashir Abumeneh, Naomi Klein, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.